Hello, this is Junichiro Horikawa, and today I would like to show you how to use a C# component inside a Grasshopper in order to import a geometry from directly you choose, such as like 3DM files or any other mesh files or any files that could be imported inside Rhino. And without using an import command in Rhino, we are going to do it all inside Grasshopper. So let's try to do that. I'm going to start by placing a C# component, and let's start by setting some input for the component. So the first input that we want is a file path. So I'm gonna name it as a file. Let's set it to string for a type hint. Right, and for the second parameter, I'm going to create a Boolean input called import. So whenever you have a true value connected to the import input, then you're going to activate the command to actually import the geometry. So let's make this Boolean. And also, I would like to preserve the geometry after I have imported the inside a Grasshopper. So I would like to create some temporal or constant or global variable inside this class, so that in order to keep the geometry after importing the geometry from outside. So after you have preserved the geometry, you might going to need to delete that preserved geometry later on. So let's create another parameter called reset to delete the geometry that has been imported inside a Grasshopper. So for that, I'm going to set it as Boolean as well. Okay. So first of all, let's create a so for the output, maybe I'm gonna rename this to geometry, since we're going to import the geometry file, geometry data. Okay, so for the file input, I'm going to use a file path node, file path component, and connect it with the file input. Right click, and I am going to select one of the geometry that I would like to import. So for now, I'm going to try to import this Rhino logo. Right. For the import input, I'm going to use a Boolean toggle so that I can double click to make it true, and whenever it becomes true, then the file should be imported. Okay, and I'm going to also create a button. So whenever I press this button, then the geometry which has been imported should be deleted. Okay, so these are the three input. Now we'll get it inside to the C# component by double clicking it. And first of all, I'm going to create the conditions if import is equal to true, or just import, meaning if the import is equal to true, then I'm going to create some activation code right here in order to really import the geometry. So to do that, I kind of need to access to this command line in order to use the import function inside of Rhino, because there is no Rhino common function in order to import the geometry. So to do that, first of all, I'm going to create a command line string like we did last time with the export script. So I'm going to first create a string named command as a variable, then start by typing an import command. So this is the import command that you can also use it inside right here. Right. By typing like this, you can call this command without using a dialog, but all those commands could be done in one line. So after you have written an import letter, then the next thing you want to specify is the file path where you want to import the file. And the file path has been connected as an input called file right here, so we can directly use this. So in order to use the file, first path, I'm going to create a double quotation string like this. I'm escaping the double quotation like this so that I can actually use this as a string inside this one line, right? And in between the double quotation, I'm going to insert this file path like this. And finally, by setting an enter command, you can actually complete the command like this. So this is the one line string, how you can which you can use this to import the geometry within Rhino. But by calling it, the geometry itself will be placed in Rhino, but it's not actually a Grasshopper geometry, so we need to convert this. We actually need to convert this into a Grasshopper geometry after we have imported into Rhino. And then as soon as we have converted into a Grasshopper geometry, then we no longer need a geometry inside Rhino, so we need to delete that. Just delete the Rhino file, Rhino geometry, but preserve the Grasshopper geometry. Alright, so to do that, first of all, I'm going to also call a command which is inside the Rhino document, active doc, to unselect all the objects in Rhino. Because after we have called the import command, the imported object will be selected, but all the other pre-selected geometries are also going to be selected. And that's not a good idea, because we want to, later on, we want to delete the selected geometry, and we only want those imported geometry to be selected, but we don't want to delete the pre-selected geometry within Rhino. So first thing we want to do is to unselect the geometries, and to do that we could write like this. Rhino doc, active doc. So this is the active document that we're opening and accessing to the objects table. Then unselect all. So this will unselect all the geometries within Rhino. Now we have just created the command string. Now we need to use this in order to activate this script as a command. To do that, we will use a rhino app dot run script. So this is the command to actually run the command script. And inside the parameter of this run script, we will just enter this command variable that we have just made. All right. And for the second parameter, this is to make whether you want to echo the script, so whether you want to write the command inside this command history. It's up to you if you want to show it. I'm going to just skip it by setting it false. All right. Now, next thing we want to do is to get all the geometries IDs that we have imported. And the imported objects are being selected, so we can get the IDs by accessing to the selected objects. So let's do that. First, let's create a selected obj variable, and then we're going to access to a command in order to get the IDs of selected objects. So in order to do that, we're going to access to the active document again, rhino doc dot active doc dot object table dot. Then there is a function called get selected objects. This one. Then as a parameter, we can choose either we want to include the lights. I don't think so. Includes the grips. I don't think so. So let's make it false false. And as a result, you'll get a eye enumerable as a output. And to make it easier to use, we want to convert the output as a list. So to do that, I would want to use a namespace called using system.link. By accessing to this library, we would be able to use the function for an eye enumerator called toList. So this will convert enumerable geometries or objects into a easy to use list. So I often use this. All right. So now we have a selected object list, and as an output what we get is a ID of each geometry that has been imported inside this list. So next thing we want to do is to get the actual geometry from this selected objects. Well, actually this is not an ID, this is an object called the class called object reference in Rhino. And this object reference, each object reference has a property called geometry. So by accessing to that geometry property, then we will be able to get the geometry information that we want to bring it inside Grasshopper so that we can use it inside Grasshopper. So to do that, first I'm going to create a new function, new list called geometries in order to, or maybe just call geos since we already have geometries and output. And I'm going to create a geometry base list. Oops. Geometry base is the geometry base is the base class of geometry, like for the curves, points, B-rep, surface, or mesh. So if you want to import the versatile geometry types, then using geometry base is the way to go. So now I have just created an empty list. Now next thing I want to do is to access all the object reference from this selected object. So I'm going to use a for loop, like for each selected, or maybe I will specify the type by saying Rhino object, selected object in selected objs. Okay, now if you type selected obj, which is this one, then use dot, then you can access to the property of the value that this one has. Well, it doesn't really give me any hint. Now let's call this geo equal selected obj dot. Okay, I guess the reason why it doesn't give me any type hint is because I guess this C# component doesn't recognize this Rhino object class. Let's try checking by clicking this test run. Then yeah, I do have some errors right here. Let's check out the error. Okay, it says selected object doesn't exist in a context. Now that's okay, spell mistake. Selected obj. Right, now it says Rhino object couldn't be found, so I need to add another namespace in order to be able to use the class called Rhino objects, and that is stored inside a Rhino doc objects. Right, so let's try this again. now the error has been gone, so now I think I can use this object. Okay, let's comment this out. Then obj dot, right, now I have some properties, and the one that I want to access is this geometry property. Right. Now this is the actual geometry information that we want to bring it into a Grasshopper. Now let's try adding this geometry inside the geos list like this. Okay, let's check if there's no errors. Looks good. All right, now well, this at this point we could try to check if the geometry has been really imported and can be read inside the Grasshopper. Now we haven't really preserved the geometry yet, but let's check this out. Okay, the output was not A. The output name was geometries. Right, now let's check this by toggle this, double click this toggle to make it true. Okay, now the object has been imported inside Rhino, and also the geometry has been outputted as a Grasshopper file as well, Grasshopper geometry as well. Although whenever I move this, well, moving it sounds fine. What if I delete these? Okay, this looks fine. Now it seems like the geometry has been preserved somehow. Okay, but whenever I make this toggle false, then the geometry just disappears. So that doesn't look good. So after I have imported, I want to be able to preserve it inside a Rhino, inside this component, even if I set the import toggle to false. So to do that, I might need to make this geos as a global variable inside this component. So to do that, you can create a variable right here outside the class, outside the function, I mean. So let's name this private list geometry base geos, and new list geometry base, like this. All right, now I am going to remove this one. I'm just going to say geos equal new list, since I have already defined the geometries variable right here, variable right here, list right here. So I have the geos already exist in here. I am just making the list to empty list with this line. Then all seems to okay, and now I can type this geometry is equal to geos outside this if function or if conditions, because geos exist outside the function as a constant variable. So let's try this again. Okay, if I double click and import the geometry, and let's try to delete the geometry and toggle off this. Now the geometry has been preserved like this. Okay, now if I have double clicked this again, the geometry should be updated. Okay, now the next thing I would like to do is to delete the geometry which is inside Rhino, so let's do this. Okay, so after we have imported, we no longer need the geometry inside Rhino, so we can delete that. To do that, maybe we can access inside this for each loop. So for each geometry, when each geometry has been stored inside the list, then right after it we can try to delete the Rhino geometry. which is this selected object. So to delete the selected object, we can access to another Rhino doc, active doc, objects, and then look for a delete function, and that is called delete. Okay, now set selected obj. Alright, and maybe for a second parameter, this is whether you want to delete the geometry quietly. Maybe yes for that. Okay. Alright, so this seems good. Let's try this. Type this, click this button and say OK. Now let's see how it goes. Double click this, and the geometry has been imported. But the geometry inside Rhino has been deleted right after it has been transferred to Grasshopper, like this. And whenever I toggle this to false, the geometry has been kept as it is. Okay, let's also try to import another geometry by changing the path. Last time I was importing this 3DM file. Now let's also try to import this obj file, which should be a mesh. Okay, and then double click this. Now the mesh has been imported and the geometry has been replaced with the new imported geometry. Right. The last thing I want to do is to delete the geometry that has been imported within this component by clicking this button. Okay, so let's do that. So I could create the functions maybe right after I have imported the geometry, like here. So if reset is equal to true, then in order to just delete the geometries, we could just make this geos list, which is right here, make it empty. So dot geos dot clear should clear up the contents inside the list. Okay, how's this go? Okay, let's try this out. Click OK. Now let's try to import the geometries. Okay, the geometry has been imported. Now let's make it to false because we no longer need to import the geometry. Then try to click this button. Okay, now the geometry has been deleted. So this is how you can use C# inside a Grasshopper to import the geometry and also preserve the geometry like this without having any geometry inside Rhino, but only on Grasshopper. Okay, I hope you find this helpful for some. Okay, so this is it for this tutorial. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.